Hi everybody, we are going to do a bit of geography. Now, have a think back to what we've been doing in geography. What have we been looking at and what is the overarching theme? So we've been looking at sort of where food comes from and with the overarching theme of sort of discovering how interconnected our world and groups of people are. And it really is. And today we're gonna be looking to describe what we call aspects of human geography. So that's talking about humans and their place in the world. And we're going to be looking at the links between food and trade. Now, trade, you might think of a trade in a game where you give somebody something and they give you something else. And that's pretty much the same thing today. When you go to buy something in a shop, you are trading essentially, but you're trading with money. You're swapping some goods, something that you want, for something that the shopkeeper wants, money. Yeah, and money only works nowadays because everybody wants it. Yeah, as soon as everybody wants something else, we might start to use that as money, or we might call it currency. But we're really looking at sort of where our food comes from and how countries work together in order to make the products and things that we need. And we had a look at this on our Zoom about sort of where we found something that come from a different country and it's made somewhere else and it's sold here. But it's really important. As our world gets more interconnected, it's almost, you might have heard the phrase, the world is shrinking. I mean, it's not physically shrinking, but there's a lot less barriers. There's a lot fewer barriers between trade and travelling. So hopefully by the end of the lesson, we'll be able to sort of look at single-use plastic and how its effects in the food production, the world food production, describe what the term food miles means, and explain why some foods are sourced from abroad. So why do we get food from abroad when actually, why don't we just grow it here instead? Describe how chocolate is made and where some of the ingredients come from. So what I want you to have a think about just first is that second point, food miles. Now, you may never have heard of food miles, but you could use some of your reading skills here in order to break that phrase apart. So we've got food and miles. What could that mean? So, food miles, we've got the word food and miles. It's just very simply, it's the distance that food has to travel to get from where they're grown to where they're being eaten. And I was really surprised, I don't know if you were, when I really looked into where my food come from, and I had a look at some of your food, and one of you, I believe, I won't say it was because I'm not 100% sure, but someone found that their, I want to say it was bananas, it might not have been, had travelled 5,000 miles in order to get to their plate. It's an unbelievable distance. But yeah, our food comes from all over the world to land on our plates, and the distance that it travels are called food miles. Now, we have a video here. I'm gonna link it in the comments bit so you can click on that, and that's a lady who's gonna tell you about the journey that food travels. So have a watch that video, and then we're going to carry on. So we're going to take this concept of food miles and have a look about a chocolate bar. So you might want to go into your cupboards if you're lucky enough to have a chocolate bar in there and just have a look at some of the ingredients. Some of the words you'll be able to read, some of the words you won't be able to read. Some of them are crazy words, like I've got one here, calcium sulfate. Lots of really unusual things that go into our food, and we're going to sort of have a look just at a chocolate bar, what goes into it. So have a look, go and find one, and then see what goes in it. So what I want you to do is I want you to take those ingredients. If you weren't able to find a chocolate bar, you can just use the ingredients that are on the screen now. Just have a think about and have a bit of a research. Where do those ingredients come from? We've had a look at where whole foods come from. So lots of you did bananas, was a good example. Lots of it was fruit. But now we're looking at the ingredients in our chocolate bars. Just come from all over the globe. And just have a look. I'd be really interested to see if you can find where they come from, and just maybe how many different countries were involved in making that chocolate bar that's in your cupboard. So here we have an example. Now yours might be slightly different. It's going to depend on who manufactured your chocolate bar or some. All of these different ingredients have their own amount of food miles. So they've been on their own journey. And what we can do, we can total these up to see the total food miles for a chocolate bar. And we see it's an incredible 30,000 miles have been travelled in order for you just to eat that tiny chocolate bar in your cupboard. It's an incredible amount. But that begs the question then, instead of travelling all these different miles, you think of all the fuel that was burned, think of all the like import or tax duties that would have had to have been paid. Why don't we just grow it in our own country? Have a think about that. Maybe you can try and list some points. Why don't you think, because it would make sense. It would make sense to me. Instead of importing all of this and then you have to like hire the ferries and the aeroplanes to ship it all here, why don't we just grow it all ourselves? So let's explore some of these reasons. So the biggest one, the most obvious one here, is the climate. There are some foods that only grow in certain regions of the world. You have to have certain temperatures. Some food has adapted to growing in cold climates, whereas some has adapted to growing in hot climates. You might notice in some of your gardens that there are greenhouses. Now, greenhouses just simulate hot countries because they trap a lot of the heat and the moisture in there. So we can create little artificial climates within our country or within our houses and things, but on a large scale, that's not really appropriate. So we've got an example here of some of our foods. Soy, so from the soybean, can only handle a 1.4 degree temperature change, so the climate change would affect the production. Excuse the postman. So yeah, if the temperature rises or drops by 1.4 degrees, the plant isn't going to grow. So think of all the infrastructure that would be involved in regulating that temperature. We've got space, agriculture, or that's like farming, the purposely growing of food or plants for food, needs a lot of land. And if we have a look back at our map, look at how small United Kingdom is to somewhere like Brazil. Now Brazil is over here. Brazil goes all the way down there. Absolutely huge. We've got places like China. And we've got some salt here. You might have heard of Himalayan pink salt. It's a very famous salt. But those countries are huge. Whereas somewhere like England, we just don't have the space to grow our own food. Expertise. Now, each of these different ingredients or different plants needs a lot of different skills in order to be able to cultivate it, and that means to pull it out of the ground. And why would you? It would be better for you to specialise in one and then work together or trade with other groups of people who specialise in something else. And the other one is the cost of production, and that's probably the biggest factor, apart from space, is the cost. So other countries have a lower cost of living and can produce food more cheaply. So they say the biggest cost is the human cost, as in it costs a lot to pay people to work in England. That's why a lot of our products come from other countries where it's a lot cheaper for them to live day to day. So their food might be cheaper, their clothes might be cheaper, the cost of their rent might be cheaper. And because all of those factors are cheaper, then it means that they can pay their workers a little bit less, and therefore lower the costs. So that's a big one. Let's have a look at some of the environmental impacts of food production. So because we've discussed that agriculture needs an incredible amount of land to produce food, we are having to destroy a lot of natural resources in order for us to grow food, because the population is expanding. There's more and more and more people, therefore we need more and more and more space. And when we take up that space almost belonged to something else. Like, there's not just free space. If we're going to knock down part of the rainforest in order to build a huge field or to plant palm trees for palm oil, then that's going to be the habitat of certain animals that has been destroyed. Mm-hmm. So we've got here some rare species lose their habitat. It's like the Sumatran tiger. If any of you have seen Our Planet on Netflix by David Attenborough, he talks about some of the orangutans. And they talk about, it's not even just some of the animals that are losing their habitats. As people, what we're doing is we're taking out some of the rainforest and we're planting the trees back, but we're only planting one type of tree. And that was a palm tree for the palm oil. And actually that diversity, that difference of trees is really damaging. We've also got the climate impact of agriculture. So we've got the loss of trees, we've got the fertilizers and the insecticides that we might be spraying on the land, and all of those insecticides that are meant to kill the bugs eventually will seep into the soil, and it will render that soil bad and things won't be able to grow in it. And what you do is you get fertilizer. How do you get fertilizer? You get fertilizer from, a lot of the time, it's from like animals, like dying animals and things like that. Or animals that have died goes into it because of all the nutrients. We've also got agriculture uses a lot of water. So it uses a ton more water to produce our food. Transporting food around the world burns fuel, and we see it quite a lot now on our planet. We've got an increase in like electric cars and even fuel, so we've got a lot of wind farms, but actually transporting our food across the planet, we've seen some of the miles, 30,000 miles. Now most adults who sort of live near to where they work won't drive 30,000 miles in 5 years in their car. A crazy amount of miles, and that was just for one chocolate bar. Think about all the other things you eat. So our carbon footprint relating to our food is growing incredibly. We've also got some other things we need to bear in mind. We've got the social and economic impacts of food production. So social is talking about people and how we interact, so like societies, and economic broadly relates to money. So not everybody in the world has enough food to eat. We're incredibly lucky in this country that, generally speaking, people have enough to survive. All around the world, that is not always the case. So as the population increases, so the amount of people is getting bigger, we're struggling to produce enough food to feed everybody. Food production, or food being produced in developing world, is being sold to the developed world, but they can't feed themselves. So actually, lots of the developing nations, like third world countries, so some of the poorer nations, are actually producing the food for some of the richer nations, because the richer nations will buy it, but actually they can't feed their own populations. Working conditions are often poor in developing countries, and that relates back to it being cheaper because the cost of living is cheaper. Maybe the cost of living is so cheap because They're not worrying about the standards or the working conditions of the people working for them. Whereas in this country, we have strict laws. We have strict laws that say what is okay for an employer to provide and what is not okay. And if your employer doesn't provide good working conditions, then they can get in a lot of trouble. But those rules don't extend across all developing nations. So we've got indigenous people have been displaced as plantations spread throughout their land. So indigenous people, an indigenous person is somebody who is from that land, and to be displaced has been to moved. So you've got a lot of the developed countries, and England has done this, lots of developed countries have done this. They have gone somewhere that is developing and actually moved those people aside, and then they've thought about themselves and about their people, and they've not considered the rights and the welfare of other nations. Large plantations require fewer workers, increasing the rich and poor divide. So what that means is, if you can build a really, really, really big factory, you can have, it's better because you can have less people doing more work. For example, if you've got a small company and you're running it with 2 people, there might be 12 jobs. Or there might be, let's say there's 6 jobs that need to be done. So you've got each of those 2 people doing what? If there's 12 jobs, 2 people, 6 jobs a person. Whereas maybe if you're in a larger plantation and there's 12 jobs, there might actually be only 2 people, but there might be 20 jobs that those people can do. So actually they're doing 10 each. So there's lots and lots and lots of things we need to consider when we think about our food and its journey. Now your task is going to be to describe how far chocolate has come before it arrives in our cupboards. What I want you to do is just to make a poster to describe and show where chocolate has come from and how far the ingredients have travelled. There is what I'll do is I'll put these slides up as a PDF. You can use the information found on these slides if you don't have a chocolate bar, or you can go out and research it yourself. Make a poster. Tell me how far they've travelled. For 2 chilies, create your own way of displaying the ingredients of chocolate and how they have made their way around the world from where they came from. So a little fact file might be quite nice. Think about how you would do a double-page spread. So you might have your ingredients, you might have their journeys, you might have a world map, you might label it, it's up to you. Then explain the good points and the bad points of sourcing food from around the world. Because as much as there are bad points, there are good points, because if there wasn't any good points, it wouldn't happen. And the final chili challenge is, in your own way, write about the good points of sourcing food from around the world and give your reasons for your findings. Do you think we're going to be able to carry on producing in this way? So do you think it's sustainable to produce food in the way that we're doing it? And maybe some of you might want to provide an alternative. So remember, lay your work out. Think about our organisational devices such as paragraphs, pictures, drawings. Pictures and drawings and labels can be a very good way of explaining some of the broader ideas, but then you can use your words and your paragraphs to explain those broad ideas. You can use a PowerPoint, you can use a video, you can make a poster. You might want to have it laid out on your floor and have a map in the middle and then put bits of string. I don't know. I'm going to leave that up to you. If you want to start it today, finish it over the weekend and submit it to me tomorrow. That would be absolutely fine. If you want to submit it all today, that's fine too. But what I would suggest is take your time. Don't rush it. Have a real good think and a real good explore about where your food comes from. I would pay particular focus on the good and bad points, because next week we're going to be focusing on some things that we can do to sort of make it a little bit fairer. So really enjoy it. Turn it into a sort of look at the geography aspect of it, how far they have to come, but think about your presentation, how you can make it. I really